We got 2 numpties. Oh, look at that. We got 3 numpties. TK, you joined while the mic is hot. We're already recording. You missed all the small talk where we gossiped about you. Are you not going to speak? I want to make sure your mic works.
That's how we do it, baby. Okay. What's up, guys? It's good to see y'all.
Nice to meet you.
How's it going?
So Jackson Lasky and David Mullenmore. Okay. I knew I'd get it wrong. I just didn't know in which direction.
No worries.
Both guys, at least David for sure. Jackson just recently, I've been following you, looking at some of your Twitter history. Both of these guys are with Unbounded Capital, which is a very interesting venture capital firm that is all in on BSV. And I would say, I think you guys have the most compelling and rational arguments for BSV that I have heard anyone articulate. A lot of BSV fans have like some really good arguments, but they also like have some weird kind of like irrational faith-based fanboyism. And you guys just have a really kind of nuts and bolts, hard-nosed, like this is why as an investment, this ecosystem makes sense. So I've been fascinated since I came across your, I don't know if it was your YouTube channel first or what, and we started kind of chatting over email. And your book is awesome. The Case Against Multi-Coin Capital or something like that. Basically like, it's basically like a maximalist argument, but one that's actually good, unlike the kind of BTC maxis that get a little silly sometimes. So TK says he doesn't like backstory. He doesn't like to asking people like, so how'd you get started and where'd you get into Bitcoin, whatever. I always like that stuff. So I don't know. Should we just start with like some current topic, TK? Am I not allowed to ask about backstory? You tell me, buddy.
No, I do like to hear some backstory. I just want to get into the ideas that people have as well. But I do want to hear some background, and I think especially with you guys, we should talk about it a bit.
So yeah, let's jump into that. I would love to know just briefly, like, where did you both come from? And then was it VC that you got into first and then steered your VC towards Bitcoin and then BSV? Or was it you were into BSV and you decided VC was where you wanted to go? I'd love to just get a flavor for your background and how that all came about.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Jack.
All right. Well, first I should clarify, well, for one, thank you guys for having us on the show. I've been a big fan of what you guys are doing for a while now. And I've actually, I think, discovered all of you independently through shows like, Tom Woods, The Bob Murphy Show, things like that. So it's good to finally get to speak with some of you guys. Let me first clarify that we're actually not just a venture capital fund. We are sort of a venture hedge hybrid. We actually have a few different funds which have different focuses, but none of them are exclusively structured like a venture capital firm, although we do make venture capital investments.
So
now
for a non like investment nerd type, a venture fund is where you are investing in startup companies that are building things, and in your case specifically BSV related. When you say like hedge hybrid, what is the hedge fund component? What kind of investments are those? Is that like you're investing in BSV by buying BSV? Or are you investing in other sort of traditional hedge fund type stuff?
Yeah, I mean, most of our hedge strategy is trying to get exposure to what we think is going to be sort of a transition from a, not BSV dominated cryptocurrency landscape to a BSV dominated cryptocurrency landscape. And so, that comes in a number of different investing vehicles, but mostly it's just a matter of like, what sorts of things are we allowed to invest in? And also the fact that when, our LPs, if someone invests $500,000 with us, let's say, we get all that money immediately and allocate it to the best of our ability. And we're an evergreen fund, so it's not like a 10-year window where we have maybe like a $50 million commitment. And then as we make investments, we call on our investors for that capital. We're always trying to maximize the capital under management. And so we just go from venture to other options, depending on like what we think is, the best risk-adjusted option for our investors at that time.
So you have a ton of flexibility. You're basically going to people and saying, invest in our fund because we have this particular outlook on the world and we have this skill at picking good places to put your money. And we're going to put it into whatever we think is going to get the most return, but it's probably going to be startups building on BSV or some other, mix of assets that we see based on our unique view of the market. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
What
obviously we have a focus, just in terms of, why doesn't every fund just say like, all right, we're just going to always examine all options everywhere in the world and like figure out what the best thing to do is. You can't do that. So we're limiting our focus in a way. When we started out, we were crypto focused generally, and now we're BSV focused since we think that that's where the opportunity is, and it makes sense to limit our focus just in terms of our time and research to that area.
So, Dave and Steve and TK, you guys know, just interrupt me and jump in anytime, whatever. There's no format here. David, I'd love to know, when did Unbounded start? And then when did you make the switch from like, hey, we're kind of investing in the crypto space broadly to BSV is it, this is the strategy?
Yeah, so the fund actually predates me. I came on board around 2 years ago. So it's at least 2 years old, a little bit older than that, I think, technically. And we were, like Jackson said, investing in broad cryptocurrency, blockchain projects. And I don't remember the exact date, but the moment that we were like, okay, we're buying our first BSV was right around the delisting. Because we saw that and we were like, this is just absolute craziness, amazing time to enter. So maybe for like a month or two before that, we had been exploring Bitcoin SV. I lived in the Bay Area at the time, and I went to the BSV meetup that Joshua Hensley and Ryan Charles run. So really we went there. We didn't know much about BSV. We were interested in big block Bitcoin, but we went there because we had this emotional inclination against BSV, and we really wanted to steelman that position and see if we were onto something or if we were just being dumb and emotional. So when I went to that first meetup with Joshua Hensley and Ryan Charles, I was like, okay, this warrants looking into. These are smart guys. These aren't, cult members of Craig Wright. So researching around that time, I think that was, do you know the month, Jackson? It was around like,
I think it was probably like April 2019.
Yeah, around there. And then bought our first Bitcoin, which was just a hedge against initially our ignorance, and then just a hedge or an investment in the space that we thought was interesting. And then eventually we came to the realization that, spending time reading all these various white papers outside of BSV wasn't yielding a lot of interesting investment opportunities. And just as fiduciaries, we were like, we can really only invest in Bitcoin SV. We want to invest in public blockchains, and they need to scale. So
what percent of your belief in BSV would you say was just like technical? Like, okay, the technicals here, this thing actually can scale, and I haven't seen any other, version of Bitcoin or any other crypto that can. And what percent of it was like something else? Oh, the people involved, or the network, or the patents, or all these other things that people talk about. I'd just be curious to hear that.
So the technical stuff took a while to catch up to speed on, right? So initially, I think we saw this is a thing that is artificially undervalued. D-List was a great example of that. So it was a good investment from that perspective. And then as we learned more, it just became more and more technically, okay, Bitcoin SV scales, nothing else does. So it's hard to say a percentage, but it definitely started out more the former and then became more technical as we did more research.
Why not BCH, for example? When, what was the thing that made you say BSV has a better chance than BCH?
Yeah. Well, we had BCH exposure. So when the fork happened, we had both chains, and we made a decision to sell our BSV for BCH at that point. And a lot of that was, I've been a big Roger Ver fan for a long time. When I entered the space, the whole cryptocurrency space in 2017, it was right after that BCH fork. And that investment started similarly for me. Also, personally, I wasn't working for a fund, but I saw everyone saying Roger Ver is this lying scammer, and I watched him. Well, okay, no. And I saw that sentiment, being widely pushed around the ecosystem. So I just kind of didn't know much about blockchain in general, but I just wanted to have some exposure to BCH because it seemed obviously undervalued because of that. So when the fork happened with BSV, initially we were kind of on team Roger Ver and hadn't really explored the technical differences. And one interesting thing for me was Roger was my resource to learn about the technical differences between BTC and BCH. And I noticed that he wasn't really giving a lot of explanation for this new fork, which seemed odd to me. So I was having to look elsewhere for information. So I think some alarm bells were going off, and I felt a little bit weird about it. But the big moment for us as a fund and for me personally was the Bitcoin SV meetup that I went to in the Bay Area.
It's funny. I had a similar experience, and I can't remember. We talked to somebody else on this show who had a similar experience. I'm trying to remember who it was. Maybe it was Josh Hensley himself. But that when you're just sort of following Bitcoin and you're, this is great, and these debates start happening, the insane way that people treated Roger Ver actually made a lot of people pay more attention to Roger, to be like, well, why would these people be going so overboard attacking this guy? This seems fishy. And it drew a lot of people, myself included, to understand big block Bitcoin and become a fan of it. And that same phenomena again happened with BSV, where it's like, why people are really insane and mad about this, but like, why? I haven't heard like a technical reason why this wouldn't work. Like, why can't big blocks work? Why can't, whatever. So that's an interesting pattern. It's kind of like, I mean, I wouldn't use this as a rule, but you could at least use it as a starting point for inquiry, which is whatever the loudest opinion is in crypto, like go as soon as possible and explore the complete opposite, like right now.
Yeah. And I mean, the first fork fit perfectly into this window where I just had this political red pilling and had to rethink my whole political worldview after the 2016 election. So I was very sensitive to fake news and trying to parse out what's true and what's not. So 2016, that happens for me. 2017, here comes Bitcoin. And it slid right into that slot. So it was very natural and very fortunate timing for me.
So is this part of your investment strategy? Because you mentioned it twice that you were interested in investigating Roger Ver more deeply because of all these crazy things you were hearing and maybe happened again with BSV. Is that part of your explicit methodology, as you try to capitalize on people's emotions, because it probably means there's some investment opportunity since people aren't being rational?
I wouldn't say it's an explicit part of our strategy. I mean, personally, my introduction to investing was through like Benjamin Graham, The Intelligent Investor. And so, I mean, if you find a good technical fundamental investment that people dislike, that's the golden ticket. So for me, I like that personally. And I remember one conversation with Jack and Zach, our managing partner, where we were just like, had this realization that, wow, everyone hates Bitcoin SV and it's amazing. It's just like the perfect thing. It's this awesome technical network. There's amazing, smart, intelligent builders working on it, and it's just loathed. So it's not an explicit part of our strategy, I wouldn't say, but it's great when it happens.
I love those, like, I call them lighthouse moments, because referring to famous saga where some economists were writing about how lighthouses could not be provided by the market, like in a time where they were being provided by the market, right in the same city where the Economist was writing, where like, I remember this happened with, there was all these debates about Zeroconf. Zeroconf, it can't work. It's shitty. It's dangerous, blah, blah, blah. And I remember being like, but I've been using Zeroconf all the time and it's delightful and it works great. Like, why are people worried about, like, well, if we have Zeroconf, how are we going to make it work? And it's like, it actually is working right now in the real world, like BSV is similar. Like, oh, well, people will just spam the blockchain with a bunch of useless data. Like, yeah, it's called Twetch and it's great. I use it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. There's so many ideas like that are so widespread and coming from authoritative sounding sources. And especially when you get into the space initially, there's just, what are the resources to learn about it? There's no formal, blockchain courses at a university that you might trust or might not trust. But you have to kind of go to this like decentralized information network online and kind of vet sources one by one. So for me, it was very difficult to kind of make sense of, what sounds good on the surface and what's underneath it. And that's kind of what Jack and I worked on in this book, was taking some surface level assumptions and exploring what's underneath it, what's informing the assumption, because it might not be the base layer that you think it is. It might be actually informed by hidden assumptions below.
Yeah, not only is it difficult to try to sort through that information, but you have a lot of people who are aware that because there's no authoritative source on Bitcoin, they can manipulate public opinion and people's ideas and cash in on manipulating public opinion by sounding authoritative and taking control of the information channels and saying, and making it so you really have to dig deep to try to figure out exactly what the heck Bitcoin was supposed to be. I remember years ago, I should probably find this reference somewhere. This was probably 2015 when a lot of the block size lunacy was happening. Somebody shared an academic article that was first line was essentially, it's an established fact that blockchains cannot scale. And then the whole article was some boring academic nonsense based on the common known assumption in the academic literature that blockchains can't scale. So it's like that level of sorting through that propaganda or just confusion, whatever it is very difficult to do.
I think
Jack, take it away.
I think a lot of it just, and this definitely, I think, informs a lot of our views as investors. A lot of it, I think, just stems from sort of an aversion to uncertainty. And, all these concerns about what can go wrong. It's not to say that it literally can't go wrong. I just think people are sort of, and I think you can experience this politically in terms of like, what if there were no police? The possibility of something going wrong, I think, is sort of too much for most people to handle. They would rather have something that was like sort of a economically unjustified solution to a potential problem than accept that that problem could exist, even if there was not an economic reason to expect that problem to come to the forefront.
Yeah, and there's a whole nother dimension too, which is people are viewing potential problems with their own personal lens of how they think the world works and what their expertise is. So in the domain of Bitcoin, you got a bunch of people that are more technically minded, which can be great, but it can also result in really big holes in your understanding of the world. So if there is a potential problem and there isn't a technical solution, then technical minds might think, oh no, Bitcoin is broken. We have to do something. We have to change the code. It's not going to work. Part of the difficulty is in Bitcoin, if there are problems, there can be economic solutions, business solutions, real world solutions, human solutions, where it might be that Zeroconf is actually not 100% technically reliable. And that's perfectly fine because you have payment processors that take up that 0.1% risk and it's no issue. And so if you have people that only are good on the technical details, like we've seen in Bitcoin Core, they can totally overlook this much larger world of like how businesses actually operate in the real world, which BCH was better on. I think they're worse now, especially after the BSV split. I definitely feel like the BSV philosophy and the general culture seems to embrace that idea a lot more explicitly.
I still think that there's a lot of big issues with uncertainty, even in BSV. I mean, I'm looking at this sort of quote unquote pruning debate, which feels like maybe I don't think it's, a debate on the same scale, even close to the same scale as like a block size debate, but I still see it as the same thing. It's like, because pruning is technically possible, there's a huge amount of concern about it. And people are, I just don't think, comfortable living in a world where they don't know exactly like what is going to happen.
Yeah. And with that one too, like play out the implications of the blocks becoming very large. And let's say they're not pruned. Is the concern that nobody at all will be running nodes? Like there will be, it's actually impossible to access the network for anybody. I just think that's totally implausible. Even if it was bloated and really expensive to run, you're still going to have some economic actors, which means the system is still going to continue.
So
Right.
I'm glad we went down this path, because this is right where I find the most interesting conversations. And I think most of the conversations we have on our little numpties show here are in this vein. And we get a lot of people who get mad about it, who are like, why are you talking about, somebody, I think it was somebody who was interviewing TK and was like, well, I would feel better if instead of, Isaac and Steve and Derek saying that they think that BSV has a higher probability of success, if they understood it properly, they would say they know it's going to succeed. And I'm like, no, everything is, and I think BSV people, they get really sensitive if you talk about unknowns and risk in BSV, which it's there. It's unknown and it's risk, but it doesn't mean on the opposite side, I think BTC people in particular are completely hoodwinked by two things: status quo bias. So like, this is what is, therefore it's inherently better than anything else that's proposed, which is weird because BSV is more the original status quo, so to speak. But they've sort of been hoodwinked into believing this 1 megabyte this is the status quo. Anything else is a dangerous deviation. But then what Robert Nozick called the Nirvana Fallacy. So when you talk about BSV and scaling the blocks and all this stuff, well, I can foresee a future when things are humongous where I can imagine all these unknown risks. And those are genuine unknown risks. They're worth talking about. Or I can imagine the risk of something we talk about, the risk of N-chain or patents or Craig Wright's lawsuits. These are actual, to me, uncertainties in BSV that are worth talking about. But if you're going to say those uncertainties exist, therefore BSV is not a good idea, compared to what? We know for a fact that BTC cannot scale. That is guaranteed to not work. So like, we understand that it can't work. Why would you then say, well, this other thing might not work, therefore we should throw it out in favor of the thing that we know won't work, right? So like, we're talking about probabilities. The probability that you can scale anything with BTC is damn near zero, unless some miracle happens with, lightning and liquid and all this bullshit. With BSV, the probability that it screws up, I don't know what it is. It's 50%, 40%, 30%. It could have things that derail it, but the known is like, we know that the status quo doesn't work. And I mean, to your point, it's similar with, government policing or whatever, when people are like, well, but if you didn't have that, what if you had something I can imagine? And it's like, yeah, that might exist. But right now we literally have an absolute disaster of a hellhole that's provable. You know what I mean? So I just find that to be like, I want to talk in that space. I want to talk probabilistically about risk. And that's what I find so refreshing about your book and your approach. It's very hard-headed. Like, here's why, compared to the actual existing alternatives, we think BSV is the lowest risk and the highest reward. Doesn't mean that we're going to be 100% right. And we wouldn't treat any of our investments as if they're a guarantee. But given everything else that we see out there, we think this has the best odds. And that's where the best conversations happen in my mind.
Yeah, and I think our fund in particular is very focused on probabilistic bet making, because both Jack and Zach have a poker background. So we're largely informed by that, even sometimes in like very like formal, in a formal sense. And I think it yields results sometimes that confuse people that aren't thinking that way. So we'll make, some small trade that ends up not working out for us. But after the fact, we're glad we made that trade. That was the right trade. It was high EV, and it didn't work out, but it was a good trade to make. So if you're not thinking that way and you just want, guaranteed returns, well, you might find a guaranteed return option, and it's going to be a scam. And if you want some upside, you got to take some risk. So thinking about that is essential for anyone that's making investments in the space.
TK, were you trying to say something like 5 minutes ago?
Well, I have a good sense of what made you guys curious enough to begin investigating BSV, similar to the BCH journey. You hear a lot of people talking a lot of smack. I have a sense of who you spoke with that made you say, hey, look, this is more than just a kind of a CSW cult. There's actually some substance here. But what's one or two things you saw that got you excited about BSV? And what makes you excited now enough to put up with all these uncertainties and risk?
The one big thing that came to mind was that first night at that BSV meetup. I went in there kind of thinking, this is going to be an argument, or insofar as I'm going to debate people here, it's going to be an argument about which Bitcoin is best or which money is best. And the competitors to Bitcoin are going to be gold, or to Bitcoin SV are going to be Bitcoin Cash or BTC or gold. And I got there and they were talking about AWS. right? So I was like, oh, okay, you guys see your competition as the internet and storage and the cloud, and that just totally caught me off guard. And it was just such a moment where I came with like ready to argue, and I instantly was diffused, and I was like, okay, it's time to listen, because this is not what I expected whatsoever.
Let's talk about the risks of BSV. What do you guys see as the biggest unknowns or the biggest risks or threats to BSV? What are the things that you pay close attention to and are worry about?
I think there's sort of two main things for me. One is like, sort of regulatory barriers that could emerge that make it really difficult for BSV to, or really probably any crypto. I don't think there would be regulation that like targeted BSV specifically, but just in general regulation, I think is a risk. And then the other thing is just like adoption. I think BSV is probably the best bet in crypto by a long shot, and one of the best bets in the world right now. But I think also one of the best bets in the world right now is like being short Ethereum. Like I like there's a good chance that all this stuff just doesn't really catch on. And I think that, we put a lot of thought into how is BSV going to be used and when will it be useful? Like what has to happen for it to be useful for things X, Y, and Z. And, the truth is the sort of real world competition is very, very good in a lot of ways. Like Dave just mentioned, AWS as a competitor. AWS is an amazing service. Bitcoin would not exist in the way it does today without AWS. And so, just because I think Bitcoin has sort of theoretical advantages from like sort of a network topology standpoint, and, because it's a more efficient payment system, such that I think there's a clear path towards it sort of reshaping the way the internet operates. I don't think there's a guarantee that we get there just because so much capital is pouring into alternatives. And until that capital pours into BSV, I think it's just going to be hard for like a really small group of people to, battle it out for, decades as other technologies are, getting better and better over time. And so I do think that there's an urgency in terms of adoption where, I obviously think it's a probability that BSV will be successful in some way because I think it has so many sort of clear advantages over existing technologies, but you have to actually get there. And I don't think it's a guarantee that we get there.
Man, that's such a powerful point that I think Jack Liu, who we talked to previously, is one of the people that thinks this way and gets it on the consumer app side. I don't know as much on the enterprise side, but that I've seen, it's like once you see what BSV is capable of, you can't unsee it, and it's easy to sort of fall down the being enamored with the tech and the possibilities and forget that people don't give a shit about that if it's not a better user experience. And so the question should always like be in the forefront of your mind. Like as a business owner, we use AWS, my company does, and I've literally never had a problem with it. I love it. I think it's freaking awesome. If somebody just comes to me and tells me why theoretically, oh, well, AWS is a dinosaur. I remember people used to do this all the time. Tech guys do this all the time. Whatever software you're using, they have some reason why you're a troglodyte for using it if you only understood. And I'm like, but it freaking works, right? Like when it comes to crypto, I think like user interface, Robinhood is the best app I have ever found to buy anything. And like, if I'm just a normal person, I don't care that it's custodial, that I'm not even holding coins. And it's this beautiful experience, right? I like PayPal. What's wrong with PayPal? You're going to have to give me a user experience, not just a technical backend that is superior, not just as good as, right? And like some of these discussions about, micropayments will make everything better because it's proof of work and everybody, maybe, but like I had a debate with a guy about like subscription services, Substack and whatever. He's like, well, why would you pay a monthly fee for a Substack newsletter when you could just pay per email that you want to read or per word and I'm like, micropayments don't solve everything inherently. As a user, I don't want to pay per movie I watch on Netflix or per minute watched. I just want to pay a flat monthly fee and never have to think about it again, right? I want that user experience, like getting in the head of the user is so important, whether it's enterprise or consumer, rather than just like talking about how the technology is so backward. So I think that's a great point.
I think it's true though so maybe you don't want to pay per movie, you'd rather just pay monthly and have access to Netflix. But I do think if you view it that way, you're viewing it in a vacuum where micropayments only affects how you pay for the service. And it would come with all these other features, right? So like one thing that I think a lot about is I hate being on like Team Netflix and rooting for them to keep my favorite shows and, oh no, they lost Always Sunny, this sucks. And I'm like rooting for this corporation to like outbid Hulu, right? And it's just this kind of absurd system. So I think like, and I do this a lot talking with my girlfriend or my family, just trying to articulate the BSV vision. And they'll say things like, well, I don't want to pay individually. But when I kind of articulate the broader scope of, okay, well, imagine if everything is accessible and it's a trivial fee, and then they start to come around. And I think it's difficult because there's going to have to be implementing these things. It's not like you can just flip a switch and everything changes. So it's a process. And how that process plays out remains to be seen. But
I mean, that's that wedge. Like, find what people don't like about Netflix and be like, we can solve that for you, instead of like, hey, guess what? You can pay 100 times a month instead of once a month. Like, nobody's mad about that right now. Maybe later, but you got to find something that they are mad about. Aren't you mad that like Netflix shows can just get pulled without you have no power, and sometimes they're not there in the selection? Like, you know, you got to find that wedge that's like a felt problem. And I just think that's a really important insight, that sometimes the more technically minded cannot sort of, you don't want to look at the market and say, oh, the market's telling me this, so let's just duplicate what already exists. But you also don't want to say the market's stupid, customers make bad decisions. You know what I mean? Like, you got to learn from the customer as well to some degree.
Hey guys, let's talk about some of these adoption risks. You named two, adoption and regulation. I love for you to address your own expressed concern about those things. Concern might be a strong word, I know. But what does BSV need to do in order to actually get that adoption? Are you seeing anything happening in this space right now that looks promising in terms of getting us there?
Yeah, I think, so something I was talking about with someone yesterday is the idea that the people who are in BSV today, I don't think are necessarily here because they're so, creative. I don't think that's necessarily one of the skills that gets you over here. And so I think one thing that gives me a lot of optimism is the advancements in infrastructure, which, what does BSV need? It needs adoption. How does it get adoption? It does something extremely useful that no one else is doing. And so there's kind of two, I guess, like main things that could be. One is you're doing something that is already being done way better, or you're doing something new. Doing something that's already being done way better, I think will take a while, because a lot of that is sort of network dependent. I think BSV it has an extreme network effect, which works both ways. Long term, it's sort of a way of ensuring continued success, but in the short term, it's a barrier because it's so dependent on the network being established. It's the classic chicken and egg problem for for entrepreneurs. Okay, where am I? So what I think is great about the advances in infrastructure, I think infrastructure is like the sort of natural place for money and time to be going right now in BSV. That's been our strategy, and I think that's most people's strategy, more or less. And I think that as that continues to improve and building things on BSV gets easier and easier, the likelihood each subsequent day that someone will do something very creative and new increases, because the cost of putting that idea into action is going down over time. So to me, we're already on the right path. It doesn't take any kind of grand coordination. Right now, the money and the time is going in infrastructure, and I think that's right. And ultimately, I think that will mean that more creative people who have the ability to see something that BSV can do that's new will come into the space, or maybe are already in the space, or can put their idea out in the world, and that process is getting easier over time.
I saw this tweet, Jack, that you had. There was a Cointelegraph article about how to get enterprise to adopt Bitcoin. And like, these are the 7 things you need to do. And I scanned the article and you tweeted like, wow, this is just a like incredible misunderstanding of how enterprise works and how Bitcoin works. What was wrong with that article? How do you think about enterprise in Bitcoin?
Oh man, I can't even remember what the article said at this point. It was very forgettable. In terms of enterprises they have budget and the ability to sort of experiment, but any kind of like big enterprise application is it's a huge risk. And I think the way that enterprises are structured, it's not necessarily conducive to taking huge risks. And so I think it's going to be hard for things just have to be really obvious, like an obvious win, I think, for enterprise adoption to happen. And we're working towards that independently because we do think that that's sort of the fastest way of establishing like a network of users is to get
so you would say enterprise is a more powerful strategy than consumer first?
Not necessarily. But what I would say is that it's a worthy goal. Because if you can get enterprise usage, one, I think it's a good way to get a lot of investment in the space. And 2, I think that depending on the enterprise application, you might be able to attract a very large network all at once, which is really kind of key in terms of establishing a network. Because if you're attracting users one at a time, but they're all dependent on the network, this is sort of the issue that people run into where the experience just isn't that good until you have a lot of people. And so the rate at which you're attracting people and losing people is such that like you're not really ever going to get to a critical mass. I don't think that's like a sort of a inherent problem with Bitcoin SV. But I do think that one way of sort of like, imagine if like Facebook adopted Bitcoin SV and Bitcoin SV payments were on Facebook. That would be a really nice way of getting like about 1 billion users into the BSV ecosystem. I don't think it's very likely for a while, but if you can, even on a smaller scale, I think doing that is really great. And also from an infrastructure sort of development standpoint, even if it's not a lot of individuals who are using it, if you can get a big increase in the usage, I think that kind of revenue will be really helpful in terms of miners taking the next step, other infrastructure service providers taking the next step. So I think it's it's an important thing to be working on, even if maybe I would lean towards some sort of a user-oriented application or individual-oriented application being what is more likely to be sort of the first large-scale application on Bitcoin.
What percent of your approach to investing in BSV, like what percent of that is banking on the coin itself dramatically increasing in value? Like, in other words, do you see a world where like, oh, BSV, the price itself isn't that high, but this is incredibly valuable ecosystem? Or is it like, no, the price is going to skyrocket, and that's why Unbounded is such a great place to invest, because we're funding these things on top of it, and those are going to drive the price up, and the more the price goes up, the richer we are because we're holding a lot of it. You know what I mean? Like, how do you balance that? Like, I think that those are both interesting approaches, and you kind of have the extreme, just hold and make the price go up on BTC, and then maybe some other coins are more about forget the price for maybe inflationary coins primarily. But I've heard people debate that on BSV as well.
I think it's unlikely that the network will prove itself very valuable and the coin won't appreciate. I mean, we've already seen there's appetite for speculation in cryptocurrency. So I think, the way that I envision this playing out is that BSV just becomes unavoidable and the obvious, most valuable, useful network. So when that happens, and when that kind of bubble pops around, BSV is this scammy garbage coin, I think a lot of capital will flow into it. And I think it does impact our investment decision, just because when we make an investment, so as Jack said, we're a hybrid fund. So when we make an investment into an infrastructure company, we're weighing that not against a cash position, but also against Bitcoin SV. So trying to imagine the order of operations there is very important for us to handle this money properly. But yeah, it seems to me unlikely that, I mean, like you have EHR data or the other big enterprises that are effectively using this network and generating tons of transactions and empirically proving all of these impossibilities incorrect. And the coin itself isn't appreciating quite a bit.
What's this thing? So I keep hearing about, well, maybe just in a few places, but this idea of contracts with miners that are paying them in fiat to process transactions, and this sort of potential future where the token itself is essentially not really a valuable thing because all the payments are happening sort of in dollars. It's just used to, I don't know exactly the technical stuff of it, but I've heard some people with some of this the things that Tal Mining is doing, talking about this. Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to like the order in which things happen. I don't think there's any way that BSV is successful where BSV, the asset, doesn't appreciate on the way. That being said, I also don't think BSV is necessary to the system. That being said, I also think BSV will be, in a lot of ways, the best currency that you could use on the system. Being the best doesn't guarantee that you will win. But I think all those things are true. So, I think it's a good thing that BSV is not necessary to use the system, because I do think that at least for a time and potentially for a very long time, there will be a lot of companies or even individuals who would prefer not to have to deal with owning BSV and just be able to pay in the way that they're accustomed to paying for things, to be able to use the BSV ledger. But yeah, I mean, I have my own views on like the Fed and money printing and those sorts of things. I think a lot of the sort of, I guess, like mainstream libertarian view on those things is sort of flawed. That being said, I still think that free market money will be better than government money, and that BSV will be the best free market money. And so I'm fairly optimistic that if BSV is successful, then BSV will become sort of a dominant money across the world, in which case I think it would be very valuable.
It's kind of a funny way to kind of get back into digital gold, right? So if you imagine a future where BSV is this massive network, it's essentially the internet, and governments are tokenizing and issuing their currency on top of it. Well, then you still have BSV, the asset, that would be, something that you could invest in. And would BSV be like a more sound money option than tokenized USD on BSV? It's likely. So it's kind of this funny thing where there's a lot of talk about digital gold, and I think most of that is kind of short-sighted and mistaken. But in the future of Bitcoin at scale that I imagine, it does have some component of digital gold, and it would be a very attractive, hard, sound money.
You sound like you're saying almost the opposite of Daniel Krawitz, which we had on a while ago, where he's basically saying, hey, look, to make BSV work, it's all about people earning BSV specifically and trying to acquire BSV, and this idea that BSV doesn't matter. It's this network, and if people are, everything they're doing with it, they're just paying each other in dollars. If I'm understanding him and you correctly, those are almost kind of like opposite approaches. So
I don't think so.
Free world where you're using the network but not the coin.
I think it just comes down to like probabilities. I don't think BSV is necessary, but I still think that like Daniel says, if you have the vision that we have, you want to be working to acquire BSV. That is what Dave and I are doing at Unbounded Capital. So yeah, I don't think we necessarily see things differently than Daniel.
I don't think there's any way realistically that the BSV network could be successful and the token not appreciate in value. There's no way you could hide that little secret from any investors. Because even if, if you had the network and then somehow we're divorced from the token, and then on that network, you just so happen to create a new token with all of these properties that would make traditionally sound money, people would go, oh my gosh, this is the most amazing invention ever. Everybody has to hold on to this this currency because it's got all these wonderful properties. So I don't think at this point, I don't think there's any way to have the network succeed and not have speculators rush into that asset.
And it would also be hugely valuable because it would buy you space on chain to do whatever you can do on chain at that point. So yeah, I think it's a very theoretical kind of academic discussion to talk about, could Bitcoin SV take over the world, and we're using tokenized USD on top of it. It seems more likely that we're using Bitcoin on Bitcoin.
I do think that there is sort of a fallacy, I think, that happens where people say oh, how are you going to pay for your on-chain data without BSV? It's all right, yes, that might be the best way to pay for it, but you can just buy it when you need it. And yeah, so I think people maybe sometimes have this mentality that you better buy your BSV now or else you're never gonna be able to use Bitcoin. And that doesn't make any sense. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, if miners have the option to pay with fiat, then then it would be trivially easy for them to put stuff on chain for you with fiat. I mean, that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, I think what is even more certain than, BSV being the long-term sort of asset of choice on BSV is that if, BSV is successful, it will be extremely efficient to shift between these different, forms of money. That seems like, a total inevitability if Bitcoin is successful.
Jack, did I catch you taking some shots at CoinGeek on Twitter?
Yeah, I think so, but I can't remember what it was. So I love CoinGeek, but I think they're, sometimes they're I think playing too much to the home crowd.
So I think it was a tweet about CoinGeek announcing a new YouTube show or something like that, and you said
they're ripping off you guys.
Apps, if you can't build apps, build what was it? Build
hype.
If you can't build apps, may as well build suspense.
All right.
Are you sick of the hype machine, I guess?
No, I love the hype machine. Keeps me going.
So what did you mean by that tweet? I'm trying to stir up trouble. You guys are entirely too reasonable.
I just thought it was funny to in this space put out oh, this video is coming out in 9 days. It's just not something that's done. So I thought it was hilarious. I don't know. I just wanted to share it.
And
so, I want to stir up trouble then. I feel like
stir up trouble, Steve.
I always am the trouble stirrer here and with the BSV discussions because I always see the elephant in the room, which is you guys are an investment a group and you're trying to assess risks, and Craig Wright exists, and every day the man gets crazier and the lawsuits get crazier. And I just watched an interview of him claiming that he personally issued all Bitcoin tokens. And that all of the tokens existed actually at the very beginning. And they don't come into existence. They were all personally issued by him with all of the appropriate legal requirements. I look at that. I'm not in your guys' position, but I go, okay, that is odd. And this is a very influential figure in BSV who is in the court system right now trying to play with the law, try to get the government involved. I see that as in my opinion, the biggest risk by far at BSV is the whole Craig Wright thing.
It's Craig's coin. We're all just holding it for him. And
what do you guys make of this?
Give it back to me.
How much worse could sentiment get around Craig such that the price would halve tomorrow? So that's one question.
But it's not sentiment. It's whether or not he can push through some of these crazy ideas, because there are a lot of people who are still very deferent to Craig and his ways of thinking. Mm-hmm. So is Craig at a level of influence? Well, where he says, by the way, I think he was either listening to the Numpty show or I just made a correct prediction in January, where we were talking about potential ways the Satoshi coins might move, could it be that you have an invalid transaction that miners just say, okay, well, this is an invalid transaction, we're going to add it to the network anyway. Or it might be that there's an old bug in the code that allows you to move coins without the appropriate checks. And maybe they're going to say, well, it's technically a valid transaction, even though it's invalid because it's a bug. He actually used that example in an interview with Ryan Charles. And Ryan said, well, how might you get these, how might government confiscate these coins? And those were the two examples he gave. One was essentially accepting an invalid transaction. The other was exploiting some of the old bugs that were in the software.
I think my read of like the old bugs in the software was more just to say that like software is sort of inherently malleable, and what matters is, sort of your, I guess, legal or public consensus. Regardless, I think Craig. So first of all, I'll come clean and say that I think what Greg is doing is great. I'm very sympathetic to basically, the majority of Craig's actions. I think it's very likely that Craig is Satoshi, and I just think he's right about a lot of things. I like Craig a lot. So maybe that just colors my perception of what's happening. I will say that I think when Craig comes out and says something along the lines of like, oh, that I own the database, or I issued all the coins. From what I know about him, I think right now he's spending a lot of time trying to sort of figure out how laws apply to Bitcoin. I don't think that this was necessarily something that, if he's Satoshi, did he know that about Bitcoin on day one? I don't think that's necessarily true. I think we're all trying to learn about Bitcoin, and I don't think Craig is, an exception to that. And so when I hear something like that, to me, it's not so important that he's saying it. It's more important, like, is this true or not, in the legal sense? Because I think that will be what's sort of consequential to me, is what does it mean if Craig owns the database, if that happens. And then, as a fund, we just sort of have to prepare for what would happen in that outcome. And, to be honest, like it doesn't seem likely enough that that's going to happen in the very, very near future, such that, I have my opinion like formulated on, is that good for me? Is that not good for me? Is that good for Unbounded Capital? Who's that good for? Who's that not good for?
We were just talking about that on the last show, that you have to, it seems like you implicitly have to have some legal theory when you're trying to analyze BSV, which includes Craig Wright and his antics. You kind of have to take a position. Is what he's saying legally plausible or legally implausible? I personally hate the fact that you have to have those analyses, because I'm not a legal expert, and so I'm just kind of flying by the seat of my pants here. Because unfortunately, it seems to be it probably is going to be a big deal whether or not it is true that Craig owns the database, or whether or not he doesn't.
I think you're kind of lost in the weeds, though, to be honest.
Okay.
So I mentioned that,
Steve, we're cornered now. We got 3 believers cornering us here.
But here's a useful heuristic. So I mentioned that politics in 2016 kind of prepared me for my crypto journey. And one very useful heuristic from Peter Thiel, actually, for navigating politics that helped me see things more clearly was, he said, in regards to Trump, he said, take what he says seriously, not literally. And once I clicked that into my brain, everything just made more sense about Trump. And I was, making wrong predictions less frequently. So I kind of use that same heuristic for Craig, who I think actually in many ways is very Trump-like, which is a piece that I wanted to write once upon a time. Maybe I will at some point. But oftentimes I take what he says seriously and not literally. And I stay kind of zoomed out, and like Jackson said, like, what would this mean if he did own the database? Or, kind of follow what he's saying directionally and not get lost into the specifics, and not try to use my, I don't have a legal background, so not try to use my background or my time to figure out if this is exactly true per the letter of the law. And a lot of these claims he's making are just legal claims that haven't been, to my knowledge, there's no precedent yet. So we'll see what ends up being true. But
do you prefer private property, Steve?
Say what?
Don't you prefer private property?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, so on that one point, I agree that I like the idea of taking what he says seriously, but not literally. I think that's fair. And one of the things I've enjoyed in the conversation with the numpties is they have consistently brought up to my helping me learn that where you should focus is on where the actual technology is. Like if you just take out the rhetoric and you actually look on the ground, how is the technology progressing? How is it built? How is Genesis structured? How is the industry forming? What is the culture like? It's great. It's like everything is right in terms of the things that are being done. But the rhetoric is very disturbing. But if you guys, one of you mentioned earlier, this idea of, I don't know if the term credibility came up, but the legitimacy of the BSV network being a important part of people using it, as at some point it has to be legitimate. Do you see the drama and the rhetoric and the Trumpism of Craig being a liability for the credibility for maybe a long time of BSV?
I think it could be, but I think people just tend to, I think perception will change as, are these the actions of like a loser or the actions of a winner?
That's so Trumpist.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think, it's like if Calvin and Craig are like, let's say the richest men in the world, and their sort of antics have culminated in success, I just think they'll be viewed very differently than the way they are viewed now. And I think people will be much more open to working with them. But I mean, I do think today, like the antics, they're a barrier, but I also, they're part of a package. And I don't know all the details of how those antics are playing into the package. But overall, like Craig and Calvin, I think have had an absolutely, transformative effect on BSV. So any sort of downside of the annex is hugely outweighed by, the investment and contribution of those two.
And also,
what do you see in
downside of the?
Go ahead, Dave.
The downside of the antics, selfishly for us, is great because they're so aesthetically abrasive. A lot of people haven't dug deeper into it, and so we got to buy $50 BSV when everybody was delisting it. So,
but to your earlier point that you can't just see a long, sustained 10-year battle of these tiny communities trying to grow. At some point, there has to be a more rapid. Some people have to catch on at some point, right? You can't be the contrarians forever if you want to have the big returns. And so, to attract institutional investment or enterprise, when is it like, okay, this is fun, the price has been artificially suppressed because of antics, to okay, this is a problem, the antics are so outsized that the market listens to antics sometimes more than technicals. Like that's a real thing. So do you see that as problematic?
I could see it becoming problematic. Right now I think we have enough momentum that it's not a big deal. I think if we're in the same spot in 2 or 5 years, then we could see talented people just seek greener pastures. I think that's a problem. But I think, the incentive, depending on like your level of confidence about the future, like your incentive in the present changes. And, if you look at like, what would your incentive be if you had $10 billion of one asset that you thought would become worthless? And you could acquire an asset that you thought would become extremely valuable, but there were only $3 billion worth of that asset. You wouldn't necessarily want to you could do it in a way, or let's say, obviously I'm talking about Craig and potentially being in that situation, you could potentially blow your load too early per se and crash the price or dramatically decrease the price of the thing you're trying to sell into the thing that's more valuable and dramatically increase the price of the thing that's more valuable and therefore get less of it. So I'm not surprised. It never surprises me that to a certain degree, Craig is like leaning into his image as like a madman. That to me, it's a very sort of logical strategy. Particularly if you have some kind of time constraint, which through the court case, like we've sort of started to see what that might be in terms of you can only start doing things at a certain time. Then there's a pretty strong incentive to like keep the thing that's less valuable more valuable and keep the thing that's more valuable less valuable, as long as you don't kill it, through doing that.
When you're raising your fund, or let's say talking to entrepreneurs that, you know, potentially you would invest in, and they're thinking about building on BSV or building on Ethereum, or whatever else, or just people in Silicon Valley in general, other people from other funds. Do people bring up, when you talk about BSV, do they bring up Craig Wright and nChain?
I think
Definitely.
Yeah. You know, honestly, like most of the people that we're talking to as potential investors in Unbounded Capital don't know anything about Craig Wright. And from our vantage point, like the presence of Craig Wright, even as like sort of a possible Satoshi, even as a 10% Satoshi, is a huge like opportunity as an investor that I think a lot of people see. So yeah, you know, for us, like the presence of Craig tends to be a positive, other than, you know, maybe we could get investment from people who are already inside of crypto at a greater rate if Craig had different sorts of behaviors. But, you know, those, what are you going to do with those people? Like, I don't know. It's fine. I'll live with it.
So what do you see about some of the other like sort of adjacent risks and the, you know, sort of the mainstream criticisms you might hear from BTC people or BCH people? Well, look, it's basically one company that owns the whole thing. The nChain, all the developers are funded by them. All the mining is done by, basically Calvin Ayre's name is on like 90% of this thing. Isn't that a centralized coin? Isn't that a risk surface? Let's say Calvin Ayre, I don't know, decides he's done with BSV or goes to prison or dies or, or something. Like, is that a risk because you have basically it's one person's project? It's sort of the critique, the simplified version of the critique. How do you guys view that? Do you view a lack of other large, you know, investors, miners, whatever on BSV and such a dominant position by Kelvin, more or less? Do you view that as problematic?
Well, the funny thing is that it's just not true, first of all. And like pretty publicly, Binance has been one of the largest miners on BSV lately, which is Binance Pool. It's not like CZ personally, but so it is, you know, much more decentralized than people like to admit from outside of BSV. In terms of development, I mean, I think clearly nChain is doing quite a bit. CoinGeek is doing quite a bit. And if they were to, you know, disappear tomorrow, I think that would be bad for the space. That, you know, a big part of our bet is that that is getting less true day by day. And on a relatively quick time horizon, I think that will be much less true. And so it really just comes down to competition. And so if you believe that this is going to be a competitive network and the incentives are set up such that it, you know, incentivizes competition, I don't think it's a huge concern. And I think a big part of it comes down to a fundamental misunderstanding of decentralization kind of as a meme and the value that that brings to the network. And people that will make claims about, oh, well, you know, nChain is so centralized, it kind of runs your network. They don't seem as concerned about Bitcoin Core or Blockstream or these other, you know, when I entered the space, a big thinker that was influencing me generally was Nassim Taleb. And I remember being really excited about crypto, but very concerned that, well, it seems like a very fragile system with these developers tinkering on the protocol. And I kind of like ignored that when the price of Bitcoin went from 3,000 to 20,000. I was like, oh, it's fine. You know, it's worked itself out. But that should be a concern for anybody that, you know, is of Taleb's mindset. And I think Bitcoin SV is a much more sound approach to that by having developer teams in competition than BTC, which has, you know, a developer team that's looking for community development funding. And it's not a very robust system.
Well, that's where BCH shit the bed, in my opinion, too. I mean, that's where they really said loudly to me, we are just utterly inferior to BSV, not just for a lot of small reasons, but like, it's just like a very, like one developer crew that literally is in control of the whole thing and just bitches all the time. It just seemed like such a bad situation that they could, I felt like BCH with the backing of Roger and Bitcoin.com, and they had a lot of things going for them. Like there's no reason why BCH shouldn't have beaten BSV if you just look at like the basics, but just fundamentally, went the wrong direction. They picked the wrong set of problems with BTC. I mean, part of them, the block size was a legit problem. But then they looked at some other things that I see as problems with BTC, and we're like, no, these are good things we actually want to emulate about BTC. We want to continue these. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it seems strange. I mean, there's a lot of economists in this space, and oftentimes I hear them, their logic is, well, the developers have the incentive to make the network better because they own a lot of it. But they just ignore the existence of collective action problems. And it's like, so 101, if you have development teams in competition, shouldn't that just obviously yield a better outcome and not hope that someone, comes up with the right BIP and improves the network and makes us all wealthy?
So what do you mean when there are developer teams in competition in BSV?
So the node development teams. So N-chain or different mining pools that are developing node software to outcompete others. I think that's superior to open source node development.
So I don't know any of the details of. I thought there was one main node implementation, and that would dominated the market. Is that not the case?
I think currently that is the case, and Jack, you might know more about the details on this, but I think currently that is the case. But the long-term vision and just the underlying ethos is that this is going to be a more competitive ecosystem than what I'm hearing from other Bitcoin forks.
Is there something about BSV that makes that more likely rather than just a stated preference?
I just think it just has to do with how much money is coming into miners, how much incentive is there for an Amazon or whatever other company to come into this space and engage in mining and potentially try and get an edge through creating their own software instead of some other type of edge, which I think is also possible. And I mean, I think it gets to the point of the risks of centralization, not sort of inherent risks, but I do think Craig and Calvin represent sort of the top of the Pareto distribution in terms of output, one more so from a capital perspective and the other from a, kind of intellectual contribution, IP contribution, whether that's a contribution or a detraction, whatever, those sorts of things. These guys are producing a lot. And so obviously, if they died, let's imagine that the CoinGeek conference got sucked into a black hole and everyone there was dead. I think BSV would be done. So in that sense, there is some fragility today with the amount of knowledge and sort of talent that's concentrated into certain individuals. But yeah, I think the antidote is really just more incentive for other talented individuals to enter. And that comes both from one, knowledge, but also just how big is the opportunity immediately. Is it a future opportunity? Is it a present opportunity? I think even if Amazon, let's say, was totally hip to BSV and knew everything about it, I don't think they're necessarily working on their own node software yet. They might just say all right, well, we'll come in with our $1 trillion or so of capital in 5 years, when this thing is actually taking off, and we'll just crush N-chain that. Can they do that? Can they not do that? I don't know. But yeah, the fact that there's a dominant node software today sort of represents the outsized contribution that N-chain and CoinGeek have made. But yeah, I don't think that's
it's
any sort of guarantee for the future.
It's hard to compete currently. I mean, N-chain just acquired Korea. They have this huge development team. I mean, they have much more capital than anybody else, but that isn't resulting in a lack of competition. So you have very ambitious BSV people like Matterpool or some of these other mining pools that are they're going to outcompete Craig Wright, and that's the goal. And I think that sentiment is actually pretty pervasive in the space, and a lot of people are trying to beat Craig.
So one of the things I liked about BCH was that they were really explicit in having multiple node implementations where they were actually developing, they were working on a block template that made syncing up multiple developments of node implementations that much easier. And I think that has now fallen through the cracks or it's gotten delayed in that development. That seems to be an explicit goal because they did learn the lessons from Core. And so I just did, I thought you were saying that there is at present multiple competing implementations in BSV, but I would say I don't think that's actually essential right now. What matters is the quality of the software, not necessarily one metric of is it decentralized or not right now. You got to also think at scale. Like BSV is all crypto is tiny compared to where it will be. Is it decentralized in 2020? It isn't actually as relevant as, are there any artificial barriers to entry, and will it be decentralized in 2030?
I actually think, so it's interesting that I do think BSV has a form of decentralization, or at least, it's holding on to a form of decentralization, which I think is really valuable, which is getting rid of the idea of like us. I hate the idea of us. The idea of what makes BCH great is they made it a priority to have multiple competing node softwares. To me, that's like the wrong approach. And people who are worried about like, what are we all going to do about X? It's, if X is a problem, or if there's an opportunity in X, I think the idea should be something will come. And I don't know if people tend not to be comfortable with that. I'm still sort of just like annoyed about getting ratioed on my pruning tweet. But I think it's a good example of like, even people who are sort of less concerned about the idea of pruning are saying like, well, yeah, I mean, like, it's not a big deal. We'll do this, we'll do that. It's like, who's we? I'm not with you. Like, yeah. I am part of Unbounded Capital. I'm trying to like invest in companies and do other things that we'll put out there in the future. But yeah, if there's an opportunity, like I'll fill it if I can, and you can fill it if you can. We don't necessarily need to talk about it. It's not that talking about it is bad. It's just that the mindset of we're going to do this, I think is wrong.
I think that's correct at scale. I think, especially when you don't have a protocol that is locked down or technically locked down or close to being locked down, it's a lot harder to avoid that way of thinking about things. So like if you have a lockdown protocol, that does allow for real decentralization of all, not just node implementations, but all kinds of ways that everybody can now use this technology. But before you reach that point, which maybe it has been reached in BSV, I don't know, there is still a sense in which like the fundamentals are not solid enough for there to be a totally different vision about what the protocol of BCH should be. Like you actually have to work together to come up with something like this block template idea. And that wasn't like some centrally planned thing of like ABC said, this is what we're going to do. And so that's what we're going to do. That was a more organic realization that people had, like, hey, it's going to be easier for competing implementations to work with one another, the actual developers, if they can come up with this program that makes it easier for them to cooperate. But yeah, I think you do have to have the lockdown protocol before you get the luxury of just being totally independent from each other.
I don't know if I agree with that. So, I mean, for one, I think, Bitcoin, I don't really think of it as like a software or even a protocol, just more of like an idea. And I think its success just depends on like how many people sort of have that idea and what idea does that, like what forms does that idea take? And so I think the idea of like a stable protocol is a good idea. And I think that as people sort of understand the reasons why stability is valuable, that I think will lead to success for those people. That doesn't necessarily, I don't think it's necessary that protocols never change. Or desirable that protocols never change. I just think it's more about the idea that like stability has value and that tinkering and like development has like sort of an inherent potential downside.
So what we saw with BTC is there were a lot of people, a lot of business-minded folks who definitely saw stability as a virtue, in 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015. But because there was still technical disagreement and you had the keys to the GitHub owned by developers with a particular idea and other people had a different idea, the net result was still the network fracturing, even though you did have a lot of people who, we're probably all in agreement about the value of relative stability of a protocol not having the tinkering. I mean, tinkering has been criticized for a long time, but despite that, we still had the BTC debacle,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think it requires some level of technical stability where you don't have to trust that the people who are changing the code understand the vision correctly, and like you have to agree with them. Where the developers still have a lot of power over the protocol. I don't think you can have as much independence as I would like to see.
When you say technical stability, what do you mean? So this is like a technical solution to this problem that you imagine, or what form?
Yeah. So something like the block size limit, would be a good example. That the fact that you had a technical issue that was unresolved, and the only people that could resolve it were developers, whether they were developers from one camp in BTC who had the keys to the GitHub, or there were a set of developers who had better ideas that didn't have the keys to that particular GitHub and they had to fork off. That requires some kind of technical solution. Like if it's still on the table for blocks to be determined by developers, you're not at the point of like independence from them. You're still your network is still heavily influenced by developers to the extent there are technical limitations on the protocol.
Well, I think you're just identifying a problem that is inherent. There is no solution. You can always make changes. In fact, I think it's interesting that you feel like this is such a problem, and you're also very critical of someone like a Craig saying, I own this. And so potentially there's a legal framework, obviously it's maybe not from the ideal executor of legal frameworks, but there's a legal framework where you actually could, because there's sort of an inherent technical problem, you could maybe come up with some sort of other solution. But yeah, I just think that it's code. Code can always be changed. There's really no way around that. And so it's just a matter of who holds that idea at that time, and will those people be more or less successful over time?
But I think there are degrees of difficulty or friction or incentive changes that make things more or less stable, right? There's no 100% stability or 100% lockdown. But for example, if you have no hard cap on block size and miners can mine whatever size blocks they want, going in and making a change, developers going in and saying, we're now going to add a cap and we're going to put a cap of 8 megs or something like that. That is going to be a more difficult thing for them to do than if you have a cap to begin with. Because of status quo bias, because there's just the various incentives. So each of these are not equal, even though none of them are set in stone. That's not the ideal. That's not actually achievable, but there are definite differences in levels of stability. So for example, if I'm a business, I can rely more on a blockchain that currently has a higher block limit or no block limit than if I'm building on one that currently is at 1 meg and I'm just hoping that developers raise it later, right? Because I can see they've already signaled that they want the bigger blocks, and my confidence in that developers leaving that alone is going to be higher than my confidence that developers are going to proactively do something later.
Yeah, so this is an even better example because this is ongoing rather than the block size, which is behind us. But the reversion to the original difficulty adjustment algorithm, that is a change. That's a technical change that has potentially large implications over the functionality of the network if it's done incorrectly and at the incorrect time, which means that we or the BSV industry are not totally separate yet from the specific decision making of the developers at InChain. So if they could make a bad decision and that affects everybody, or they could make a good decision and that affects everybody. But we're still, I guess what I'm trying to say is when that's over, when the difficulty adjustment is back to how it used to be, that is going to allow a new level of decentralization from the developers, because there's not these big issues that we have to rely on them to sort out correctly.
I think you rely on them just because it takes a lot of capital to do it. And there's really only one group who is in a position to be putting that much capital towards like node software today.
So if was that not the case with Blockstream raising a bunch of money financing devs in 2015?
It was an issue. I mean, I think it will become a big issue for them.
Yeah, but if you're looking at how is the system structured, I think it would be a mistake to say that in 2015 the industry did not have a very tight connection to Blockstream developers that were employed by one company working on technical issues that affected everybody. I think it would be the same type of error to think that anybody building in BSV right now is not still dependent on those important technical decisions from in-chain. Now, fortunately, I think they've made a lot of good decisions, and we're closer to the point where they're going to be less and less relevant, but we're not fully there yet.
I agree.
Although you do kind of already see signs of this. So people are frustrated with n-chain over certain, like the amount of transactions you can chain together. There's like some cap on that. It's like 25 transactions or something like that. And people are, I mean, you see this on Twitter a lot. If you're on BSV Twitter, people like tagging shatters, like when is this going to go away? But that creates an opportunity. So if Matterpool or Tal are mining transactions without this limitation, then they're going to be more successful. Maybe, some service will route the transactions to this miner and they have an incentive to do so. So I think that's what's lacking in the BTC space, when mining isn't really this competitive business. It's a hashing game.
Well, one point on this, and then we can move on to another subject. But the unchained transaction limit is actually something that was in BCH as well. They've been dealing with the same problem, and it's not quite so straightforward to say that, well, if another node implementation fixes it, then they're going to get business and outcompete in-chain, because there are significant risks to miners running implementation that is not the dominant implementation. So you may actually have better technical software, but if you're not the majority software that's being run, you have a higher risk of being forked off the network. So whatever node implementation is the dominant implementation has they have a really comfortable position, because the costs of switching to another implementation are so much higher. That was one of the reasons why I liked this block template idea in BCH, is specifically to reduce that cost to miners to run multiple implementations at the same time.
This is what we saw with Bitcoin XT or some of these other attempts in the past, that it's unfortunately that the nature of the ecosystem, unfortunately, whatever it is, it's just reality. It's not simply, hey, if you just go make a better version, a better implementation, then miners will just run it. Like there's a lot of dynamics at play. So that's where Steve's, reducing the friction of switching between implementations, for example, improves the incentive structure, I think, at least, potentially. Dave, I want to ask you something about this crazy, ridiculously entertaining court case down in Florida. You got Craig being sued by the brother of, his former partner, Dave Kleiman. In this case, it's like, there's just always something new dropping that's just like wild and zany and absurd. And everything about this case is just bizarre and crazy. Do you think that this case is just irrelevant? It doesn't really matter. It's interesting. It's fun. Or do you think this is a big deal and something big is going to come out of this?
I wouldn't say the case is irrelevant. I think who wins or loses the case isn't paramount for investors in BSV. What happens if Craig wins is he gets a lot more money than he otherwise would, potentially, depending on what the outcome would be if he lost. I think the big story of this case is, did Craig Wright invent Bitcoin? And on that point, there isn't really much disagreement between either side. So the big impact that I see happening from the actual resolution of the case is that bubble popping of people being like, well, everyone knows Craig is a scammer fraud and he's not worth listening to. I think it will become clear that he's much more worth listening to, at least, when this is over. And the reporting on it has been kind of crazy, and there was more reporting on it initially from crypto media outlets. And the story was kind of, haha, Craig's being sued for stealing things. Isn't he such a fraud, right? And that's not a very profound reading of the case, since the fraud that's being alleged is that he was Satoshi and he stole the other half of Satoshi's coins and IP. So they kind of stopped reporting on it. I've noticed like less reporting on it from the crypto media. But I think the outcome is that it's much more clear that Craig played a role in Bitcoin's creation, and maybe he's not such a loon. And I think that will have an immediate impact on the price of Bitcoin, and hopefully attract developers that otherwise might write it off to look into it and come build on it. So that's what I'm looking forward to. And I hope Craig wins. But
what do you think is going to make that more clear? Like what will come out that hasn't already come out that would, so even, so both of the parties to the case are like, yes, Craig is Satoshi and he owes me money. No, I'm Satoshi, but I don't owe you money. That's all known, and everybody's seen that already. And they've seen all the testimony so far. Like, is a judge saying, you owe him this money, even though we don't know if you have it, going to make people say, oh shit. Like, I'm wondering what more will come out that will create a higher level of respect for Craig. It's hard for me to envision an outcome that does that.
I don't think that is known. I don't think the specifics of the case are known. I think there is a version of the story that's told that is Craig is a liar. And that's just like not really, that is part of it, but it's not the story of the case. So I think it's easy to kind of manipulate like, oh, this deposition was released and let's take the parts that look bad for Craig. And there are parts that look bad for Craig in these depositions. And let's, show people that there's other really interesting stuff that looks really good for Craig. And I think that's been kind of buried. So I think it's, selective on what they're reporting. And but that's what I mean. Like,
given that people are already sort of have the chance to look at all the facts and say, oh, there's some things that look good for Craig, and they're not doing that. Why would they suddenly do that when the case is over? I'm not talking about whether it's true, but why would that change the public perception?
If he wins, especially, I think the reporting has to be different. And I think also the tier of reporting, well, I don't think the New York Times is like top tier, but the tier goes from Cointelegraph to the New York Times, right? It's a bigger story, like, oh, the Satoshi guy, he's been unveiled. And it also matters what happens surrounding it. So, Craig has made this kind of, if you believe what he's saying, this principled argument that I'm not going to sign because code isn't law and law is law and all this stuff. So if once he feels that he's legally vindicated and he's followed the process of law that he wants to instantiate, and then he signs things and moves coins, then I think it's like, well, this is going to be pretty hard to argue against.
But hasn't he also argued not just that I'm not going to sign because on some principle, he's also argued I can't sign because I was supposed to get these keys. Oh, they showed up. Oh, wait, a week later, someone stole them from my computer. Like, it's all very, very confusing. Like, yeah. And you said earlier, you think, or maybe it was Jack, you said, he's playing this rational game of like, hey, I want to appear like the madman. And I can buy that. But you kind of can't have it both ways. If he's trying to appear like the madman, he wants you to think he's not Satoshi. He wants to be crazy and all over the place to confuse and whatever. Or he wants the simple truth to happen in this linear process where a court says this and then the keys do this. Like, those are contradictory stories. And I kind of hear both said by Craig himself and by sort of his supporters. And I'm not anti or pro Craig. I think the guy's fascinating. I've learned a lot from listening to some of his stuff. I find him hilarious and entertaining. I find him bizarre, but I just truly am trying to figure out what's going on here. And I don't think I've ever encountered something that is harder to figure out what's going on without resorting to crazy theories of like 3D chess and subterfuge, which like there is no Occam's razor here. There is no simplest explanation.
Right.
Yeah, Isaac, I share some of your reservations about like what impact will the case have, itself, the conclusion of that case. Something that we've experienced sort of seeking to get broader media is that you run up into this sort of two-sided, enclosure where on the one side you have crypto media, which like absolutely despises what we're doing. And on the other side, you have mainstream reporting, which absolutely despises crypto generally because crypto sucks. So there's really I don't know exactly where the information goes. I could see it having a benefit. I'm not sure. I think I'm slightly less bullish than like other members of our team about, what does the resolution of this case, just that detail alone, how does that impact things? I do think there are sort of like legal reasons why if you were going to move assets, you might wait until after a trial where like those assets were being sort of, potentially there was going to be an issue if you moved those assets. So I think that plays a role. There's also some other things that sort of happen in the official Craig narrative, over the summer and around the trials, such that it might be a natural point for things that aren't necessarily because of the trial, but because of the sort of culmination of the trial or other sort of incentives Craig has at that point, where perception could change and coins could move. There's, the sort of madman thesis. I don't think it necessarily has to be everything was pre-prescribed from the beginning, like how I'm going to be a madman in this exact way. But I think once you're rejected as Satoshi, if you know you're Satoshi and you've been rejected, you now have like a big opportunity. And so potentially,
that's the poker player talking, I can hear.
There's a plan that like sort of springs based on like new information. It's like, I thought people were going to accept me and I was going to be able to like reshape the direction of this. And then they said no. And now maybe I have another opportunity to sort of like create my own little space where I can actually, 10x my ownership of Bitcoin. That's sort of maybe an interesting wrinkle that like you wouldn't have thought of at the very beginning of this if you were in that position. But I don't know. You're right. There's no Occam's razor. Like, I don't know what's happening.
Well, it's funny
I see
like
some incentive to sort of play into the narrative of you're fake.
Well, the logic of not, let's say Craig is telling the truth about everything that he's saying. He's got the coins, he's Satoshi, all this stuff. The logic of not moving them, not signing, whatever, all that makes sense. Like, to me, given all the various implications, that seems like probably the most rational strategy. But then a lot of the things in this court case don't make any sense along with that, because it's like, okay, you are ordered to tell us where these funds are. And then it's like, okay, here's a bunch of addresses. Oh, it turns out it's not in those addresses. And then like, oh, well, here's these, I got to get the other parts of the keys. Oh, wait, I they're not here. Oh, now they're here. Okay, now they were stolen. Like, he's either lying under oath or he has no idea how to access these things. And so it's not even a strategy to not move them. It's just that he can't move them. Or like, I don't know. There's a lot of strangeness in there.
One thing is very clear, that Craig has obfuscated his past. And maybe that was, and it's kind of an interesting fact because it fits both narratives, right? Craig's this like liar, he's pretending to be Satoshi, or he is Satoshi and he kind of wanted some privacy. So I think that's certainly true.
Or he can't decide and he's gone back and forth. He really wants credit,
Sure.
But he's also worried and wants privacy, and he's kind of torn and has like done a little bit of both at different times.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dave can give you the details on this, but one interesting example is like the Tool of Trust 3.
4 now, I realize.
4?
Yeah.
Or just things about like, I legally, by like the laws of Seychelles, which are obviously the most important laws in this case, couldn't reveal this information to you until this date. And so even though I have like, I'm contradicting prior testimony, or like I failed to comply, it was because I had to follow the laws of Seychelles. And so I do think also like, the one thing that feels very certain is that I think Craig really loathes IRA. Which, if you follow the details of the case in terms of like Craig and Dave Kleiman were friends.
Or at least that's part of the theatrics that they want you to think.
Yeah, I mean, there's that angle too. That's possible. But it doesn't seem like Ira and Dave Kleiman had a good relationship. And it seems like Craig sort of reached out to Ira sort of somewhat generously, maybe maybe had an obligation to do so, but it seems like he made an effort to sort of bring Ira in, and then Ira was just sort of has obviously become maybe a bit of a pain in the ass, such that now, like, if there's a way where Craig can sort of within the bounds of, not going to jail, make Ira's life more difficult, I would not put it past him to do that, because he just wants to, like, throw a big middle finger to the guy who is sort of like disgracing his brother's legacy.
So, okay, I gotta ask you guys this, because this is something that I don't even know if it's possible to do, but to attempt it would be interesting. I've thought about it for a long time, but you're poker players, you know all about bluffing. You've got this investment thesis that requires BSV to be a certain thing for you to succeed. Have you ever tried to run the numbers and assess, from an economic standpoint, the claim that Craig and Calvin, it's a total scam? Maybe they know Satoshi's dead or whatever, and they're playing this long game to somehow, through some shenanigans, get Craig access to these coins. And then he's got, he's a bajillionaire and they can split the profits. And then Craig came to Calvin and was like, hey, check it out. I know an insider tip about this Satoshi thing. I think if we play our cards right, we can actually get access to those. I can claim to be Satoshi, blah, blah, blah. If that were true, what would the cost benefit be? Like, how much money has Calvin been spending? How much have they been losing? I know they're making money on some things, but they definitely seem to be losing money on most of the things they're doing in BSV for a pretty long period of time. Like, how the risk of that con, right? They'd have to have a high level of confidence that they're actually going to get these coins, that they could actually sell them, blah, blah, blah. And they would have to know that the value they're going to get far exceeds everything that they've spent so far. But like, would you run those numbers? What would that look like, right? Like, for that scenario to even be economically possible.
Well, I think that's actually one of the strongest cases for Craig being Satoshi, because the cost benefit is sort of ridiculous. If he's just like, imagine like the audacity of just trying to do this. Yes, like there's potentially like a big reward, but I think, people are not making economic decisions, nor should they, purely on like how many dollars is this. You have to sort of factor in, like, what's the cost of like going to jail? Like, what's the cost of like losing my reputation? What's the cost of like being murdered? And so I think when you look at the likelihood of success of sort of coming out with just like a totally bald-faced lie and just trying to sort of like scam your way to Satoshi's billions, also knowing that, like, if you're not Satoshi, like Satoshi could always just like come out and be like, no, sorry, like you almost got away with it, but now I'm here.
Yeah, like I feel like
it doesn't make sense. Also, the amount of work he's doing and has done, which is, that's not really in dispute, like the man's output. So that's a pretty
the value of that output may be in dispute, but the sheer output itself is not.
Yeah, exactly. You're putting in a lot of effort and sort of just like really rounding out the idea that you've been sort of like a very prolific creator of like intellectual output for like many decades on relevant topics.
So the funny thing about that vision also is that would require all of these fake emails to be produced, all of these fake contracts going back to 2009, just so much fakery. And then, the process of doing all that fakery would be so antithetical to Craig's vision of Bitcoin that he's pushing. So it'd almost be like Craig and Calvin got together and decided to commit the last act of fraud, because when they succeed, they're going to make a system that would make this type of thing impossible thereafter.
Well, no, I'm talking about a scenario in which they don't even give a shit about BSV. It's all just a ruse, and they're just going to get access to those coins and be like, boom, we're rich. See you guys later. We don't care anymore about the network, right? Like, but here's my I love the con artist question because, as Steve has pointed out many times, like there have been incredibly bold, crazy level cons in history that have happened. But I always ask, like, there's a couple questions that raises my mind. Like, okay, so say Craig is a complete con artist and he's lying about all this stuff. It would have to be the case. I mean, it would have to be the case that he somehow has access to some information that only Satoshi would have, even if it's nothing more than knowing that Satoshi is either dead or not going to do anything about Craig making these claims, which would mean he was close to Satoshi somehow, which is interesting. That if he's a total con artist, he's a con artist who somehow was close to Satoshi, which may or may not mean anything. But my question is always like, what's the con? So what is he trying? What is he getting from this? And people will be like, oh, well, like notoriety and riches and whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, notoriety that he's getting is all negative, like for the most part, with the exception of his small fan group. Riches, I don't know what do they think he's getting? What people who are like, this is all a con, where's he getting money for this con? At what part does he make money by making this claim? Like he goes around, talks about being rich and acts like he's rich, but nobody ever seems to answer, where is his money coming from? His detractors or his fans? Like when and where did this guy get a ton of money? Like, you don't just get it by being like, I'm Satoshi and I'm lying. People don't just throw you money. It's like, how did that happen? You know?
It's also a con with incredible foresight because per witnesses that are testifying against Craig in these depositions, this started in 2009. So in 2009, when Bitcoin is nothing, he's beginning this con where he could just, go buy Bitcoin and become rich. It's like a very strange time to start the con. It makes sense to start a con to pretend to be Satoshi when Bitcoin is worth $20,000, but to do it when there's not even a market price is very strange.
It also would be a very sustainable con. I think something that a lot of people overlook is every 2 weeks, we have some sort of new argument or new research indicating that he is supposedly a fraud in a new way. And so all of the people who are investing in him get a fresh opportunity every 2 weeks to stop investing him in light of new evidence. So if you are deceived at one point, like let's say he deceived you like 3-4 years ago, you get an opportunity every 2 weeks to go back to him and be like, hey man, they just showed this new thing with you lying. Can you explain that? And so he would not only have to be like a one-time con, fooling you into thinking he's Satoshi, but he's got to be able to keep fooling you for like 4 years, even though the entire internet reveals new evidence of dishonesty every 2 weeks.
It's every 2 weeks. It's the fraud adjustment algorithm where, a new level comes out.
Yeah. There's also,
go ahead.
Well, there's also this idea of like, and I think this is something that maybe Calvin is like pushing back against through his sort of like pro BTC Twitter presence. But if you were trying to like have this con, yet you were like trashing the thing that you're trying to con your way into getting, you're saying like BTC, the thing that's most valuable right now is trash. And by the way, I'm going to like try and like steal it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if it has a market price, I think that the theory that I've heard, I didn't go into the details of, but that sounds most plausible to me in the pure fraud scenario is something to do with like the Australian tax credit system, where there was like millions of dollars of supposedly of grants and tax breaks, some mischief related to Bitcoin. I don't know the details of, but that type of thing in theory sounds like a plausible way that somebody would try to pull off a con like this, or that's where the money would be coming from, is by trying to use some other system.
So by trying to show the tax office that you're running a business, so you get but tax credits.
I don't know. I wish I knew the details.
It's not like here's a check, here's a bunch of money. A tax credit is normally like a credit against not having to pay taxes on those parts of your operation.
I think the idea is like, I'm in trouble with the law. What's like a way I could get out of it? Well, if I was Satoshi, like that would be a way out. Is that sort of the idea?
No.
Okay.
It was something like government. There's specific government programs. Like I don't know if they were trying to invest in R&D or trying to get some government contract, and they needed. And part of this theory was that in order to get these contracts, you had to have specific certifications, or people on your team had to have specific certifications. So this is why he's got the wheelbarrow full of degrees, is to try to qualify for these government programs. But again, I don't know enough about it to
It seems like a crazy ruse. It just doesn't seem like the cost benefit on that.
Well, I mean, if this is a con, it has to be a crazy ruse. I mean,
crazy in the sense of like, there's just much better cons that you could do. And this is a very high effort con with like a low probability of success. And
maybe it's like it's like a radical anarchist Guy Fawkes move. I am so offended by the Australian tax office giving tax credits out to businesses that I am going to forge an entire company to take all those tax credits, and then I'm going to give them back.
I feel like Walter Block would actually support this idea, right? I think he's made arguments like that.
Dave, you said you're working on a little bit of a synopsis on this court case.
Yeah, so I mean, there's thousands of pages of depositions that have been released pretty recently. So we've been going through it, and it's like my opinion on the case changes a lot depending on what I'm reading. It's just like it's all over the place. So when the team has a high level overview of kind of everything, and we can kind of piece together what's going on, we're going to write something up. How public that write up will be remains to be determined. But yeah.
I love that this court. Oh, go ahead, TK.
What's the most interesting deposition you've read? I mean, obviously there's a lot of them. What's been the best read for you?
So we just sent out a newsletter the other day, and we took some quotes from the deposition of Craig's uncle. And that one I'm kind of like I'm a history guy. So
that's the one that's like the plot of Cryptonomicon, basically.
Yeah, I saw, your twitch on that. I mean, his uncle's just a very interesting guy, and he kind of gives the background of his father, Craig's grandfather, and his influence on Craig. And I mean, Craig's grandpa, I guess, was like in Douglas MacArthur's like inner circle doing code breaking in World War II. And it's like unbelievable stuff. But coming from this like very decorated 80-year-old veteran who seems to be just like, if you read the deposition, you'll see he's like a very sweet guy and also very sharp. He gave great answers. But that's a really good one because it's like 80 pages long, and it's just like packed full of crazy stuff like that.
I love that this court is trying to, deal with all this highly technical stuff. And the only way they have yet figured out to share publicly the publicly available information is like these freaking unreadable PDFs. Like, why can't court documents just be in like normal text where I can zoom in and it's impossible to read this stuff?
I think Court Listener is the private solution, because the real source that Court Listener is pulling from is even worse.
What are they using, like a typewriter?
There's some like source, or maybe Court Listener is .gov. I don't know, but it's a pain to track all this stuff.
I thought I'll answer your question, TK, and say one of the things that was interesting in the deposition was what you were sharing in our Voxer thread. I've read almost none of the depositions, but it was the Antonopoulos one that I read, and boy, that sure was fascinating, because he had all kinds of opportunities to shit talk Craig and speak very confidently, but man, he chose his words very carefully, what he said and what he didn't say. He's not making a claim about Craig being Satoshi. It's interesting to see him back down.
Yeah, if there's one thing Antonopoulos did not do, he did not clearly articulate the belief that he thinks Craig Wright is not Satoshi.
No, he didn't.
Even when some of his tweets were read, where he clearly, was calling Craig fake Satoshi, he talked around it in such a way so as to make sure that he was completely non-committal about his.
But he was very committal about his non-committal. He made that very explicit.
So in the very least, we can say that he believes there is a greater than 0% chance that Craig is Satoshi, and that there is some risk that he could actually be sued for libel if he wasn't careful. Like he's very conservative, and he thinks it's a very small risk, but he definitely thinks there is a risk. I mean, it's hard to not just be like side-splittingly entertained by Craig's depositions himself. Like just the craziness of these back and forths was like, Did you write this email? That's not an email. Yes, it is. It's an email. No, that's a piece of paper.
Oh, the Craig ones are great.
It's a printed email.
Yeah.
Well, that's not the same thing as an email. Like, I mean,
if you want to watch Craig toy with lawyers for 3 hours, read his 4 depositions, because there's a lot of that.
I also thought it's funny. He talks about, you know, if you listen to his discussions about law, it sounds like he puts law on this pedestal. But then when you're actually reading some of the depositions, you get the impression that he's mocking the whole legal system, you know, which I kind of appreciate. But he does not get the impression of piously speaking with the lawyers to make sure that everything is clear. He loves the law,
but they hate him.
Yeah. I don't think he's a law and order guy in that sense. I think that's kind of a misconception. I think he's pushing back against a, you know, common belief that code is law and law doesn't exist. So it's not accurately reflecting how he views the government. I think Jack wrote a great piece on Craig Wright. Maybe you can speak to a little bit, but I don't think he's this big law and order guy. I think like he is like a minarchist.
I definitely didn't used to be a law and order guy. Yeah.
The cynical take is that he never was. And then he was like, shit, I'm never going to get these keys. I need a court to give me access to this. And all these crypto people will freak out if I don't have the keys. So now I got to spend the next year hammering that keys don't really matter. It's really what the government says that matters. And he like created this whole like law narrative to say that's what proves ownership.
That wouldn't be in line with his pre-Bitcoin, his work experience. Like,
I know, because he had the keys then, or thought he was going to get them. But once he realized he wasn't going to get them, he had to quickly like switch
no, I'm saying.
Oh, you're saying he was like that before?
Well, I mean, I had heard Craig talk about, you know, working with like law enforcement, and that was kind of this meme I had in my head. But it wasn't until reading all these documents that like he was, unless he's totally lying, he was working with Department of Homeland Security and organizations that were close to the NSA and NASA. And I mean, and this kind of goes to his family has a history with military intelligence. So, you know, it's a crazy story, but I do think like he does have a respect for law, but he sees the problems that, you know, I think a lot of us would agree exist within law.
Yeah, the piece I wrote is actually like, Craig has really made me think a little bit differently about my own sort of philosophy as an ANCAP. It hasn't changed it, but I do think it has sort of like exposed some areas where I think ANCAPs are kind of weak on the whole. And it's in sort of a sense that they're being inconsistent with their own philosophy. But yeah, I think in general, like we have as ANCAPs this sort of mechanism for establishing laws through contract, but then that we're sort of antsy about the idea of like enforcing those laws because law enforcement has such sort of a negative connotation. So when you talk about something like creating like anonymity, or so creating a protocol where you could transact and communicate perfectly anonymously, it's really not very consistent with the idea of like law enforcement, regardless of whether those are like privately conceived laws or public laws. And so as like an individual in the world, you have to make your own decision about like, is it worth it to create a system that like can't be sort of reeled in by any laws, regardless of whether they're laws I like or have, agreed to follow or laws that were imposed on me? Is that a good thing or not? And I think it's pretty reasonable as an ANCAP to come to the conclusion that having a system that can exist outside of any laws is not a system I want to be a part of, even though I greatly dislike the way and find the way that laws are come to today to be immoral. I see the same kind of thing with IP, where it's like, I think ANCAPs can be pretty annoying about IP because to me, they're talking about the wrong thing. It's not that they're wrong, it's that they're talking about the wrong thing. The first thing they talk about is that it's not the same as like physical property, and therefore like it's not covered by the non-aggression principle. And that's fine, that's true. But that's not really relevant. The second thing is that it has this sort of like ugly history of being sort of like these king granted, like, all right, you're the only one who gets to produce X. And that's ugly, but that's also not necessarily like an argument against the idea of like creating IP laws. Because clearly, like in a system of private law, you could create contractual obligations around the idea of IP. And so to me, the real question is like, in a world with government IP laws, do you use them? And I don't think it's a simple question. I don't have the right answer. I think it's reasonable to come to the conclusion that like, I find these laws to be too unethical for me to use. And obviously, like, do they benefit you or do they not benefit you? Also, I find that to be sort of irrelevant to the main crux of the conversation. But yeah, I don't have a good answer, but I think it's not an unreasonable answer to say like, I would want to live somewhere that had IP laws. The most accessible IP laws to me are these government IP laws. And I'm going to use this system, even though I personally would believe in a system of private laws and would opt to live somewhere that had private IP laws. That's sort of my ideal.
Yeah, I don't think there's any logical or moral inconsistency with, you know, just understanding, okay, let's say I want to live somewhere where, you know, my physical private property is protected, and the only options available to me are where that is done by government, and they won't allow me to hire my own protection agency or whatever. It doesn't make me, you know, immoral to go live someplace where that's done, even though I wish it wasn't done. It, you know, may or may not be impractical. Those are interesting conversations to have. Like, what relationship ought you to have with IP in the real world, despite what you don't, you know, do or don't like about it. I think and I have a very, very non-hardline and a very nuanced look at law in general, because when I think of law, I do not think of legislation. I do not think of government law first. I think that's what most people are talking about. And like civil law, all of this stuff it all came out of private stuff. It's the government monopolized portion of it is relatively small and relatively new. It's just the one that everyone thinks about and talks about. So most people don't even know what they're talking about when they say law or government. Like, most of that actually is private contract and whatever. But I think what I react to strongly in the BSV community, it's the opposite. It's not like, hey, look, there are interesting conversations to have here. Like, if you're a business, should you patent something, even if you hate the idea of patents? Or, you know, should you have NDAs that are private contracts, or should you blah, 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 blah. Those are all good, fine conversations to have. And it'd be stupid to say, no, anything that ever has a patent on it is evil and immoral because I'm an ANCAP. Like, that's dumb. You should be able to talk about those things like a sensible person. The opposite, though, is what I'm reacting to, which is like, patents, therefore we win. And anybody who violates a patent is an evil criminal. No, absolute bullshit. That's wrong. Patents do not equal victory from a practical standpoint. Patents do not equal victory from a moral standpoint. Violating patents do not equal immorality, and they don't necessarily even equal that you're going to get busted by the law, because that shit is totally murky, confusing as hell. Like, this is not some clear cut, like, patents, good, victory, we have them, you don't. Like, that's just the height of ignorance, in my opinion. Like, that's shutting down the conversation too, just in the opposite direction. It'd be stupid to be like, anyone who ever patents anything is wrong and I'll never work with them. But it's equally stupid to be like, you don't have a patent, get out of here, we have patents. Woo! You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it is a really important question, because I think in a world on Bitcoin, patents are potentially a more logical way of trying to sort of build in margin to your business. I think in the sort of traditional tech world, it's been more important to like move quickly, establish a network, and get your margin from having a network and not worry about being dragged down by, one, having to create, and two, having to defend IP, which can be very, very expensive. And you know, it's potentially not money well spent compared to just growing your business. But I think in the world of Bitcoin, with the sort of public and interoperable nature of it, it's going to be very hard, I think, to create networks for a lot of applications that today can create margin by having a network, because it's going to be, I think, much, much easier for other businesses to sort of tap into the network that you created and potentially sort of siphon off or serve users simultaneously. You could imagine like social medias today. To me, this is something that would make a lot of sense to sort of transition into more of a universal social media where different viewers kind of are pulling from like the same set of information, and there's sort of a broad interoperability. And so if that's sort of the direction we're headed, then I do think it becomes a more reasonable strategy just from like a pure business standpoint to take an IP approach. I'm still sort of trying to figure this out for myself. I don't have like, I don't know the answer, but I do think that the lessons of Silicon Valley about IP are not necessarily going to apply to a world on Bitcoin in terms of, is this a good strategy or not? And so, I think that's something that Bitcoin entrepreneurs really have to take seriously is what is like the value of IP potentially to your business long term. And I don't think that the lessons of the past are necessarily going to be prescriptive. And then the moral question is sort of a separate thing, although, in any individual's case, they're sort of tied together.
Man, I might just be missing. I don't really see the business case on the IP stuff. Like this sort of Silicon Valley approach you mentioned, that's very, very new. Most of technology history since patents were, sort of became famous and started stymieing technological progress when the steam engine came along and have been fucking it up ever since. That's the status quo. The Silicon Valley approach is quite different. So like, to me to say, yeah, that Silicon Valley approach won't work, because they haven't really done a good job of like building big networks or anything. We better do what pharmaceutical industry has been doing for all these years, which is like, seems absurd to me. So maybe there's something new, completely new, or a new approach that is necessary for dealing with these kind of questions on Bitcoin. But it seems like if you're going to pick a model, what is Bitcoin? I mean, it's a network. It has to have a network effect or it's nothing, right? It's a network effect business. All the companies that have built themselves on massive network effects, they maybe started using patents later on in their history when they became big, but like they took a totally different approach to these sort of R&D and like pharmaceutical, biochem, all this type of stuff. You look at those two, which one's a better model for Bitcoin? To me, it just seems obvious from a business standpoint that you would go with the Silicon Valley, the network effect business approach.
What I'm saying is I don't know how possible that's going to be.
Why? I guess I don't understand why that wouldn't be possible. Like, because, well, there's going to be a lot of competitors because the cost to entry is low, but that's exactly what's happened with Silicon Valley. And
it's not just
they'll have big winners.
It's not necessarily the cost of entry. I think it's more so the cost of switching for users, or the cost of like creating an environment that doesn't sort of interface extremely fluidly with the rest of, the world as a business.
Does TCP/IP, does somebody own a patent on the protocol?
I'm not sure.
I don't think so. I could be wrong about that, but I don't think so. Why could you not have the underlying data structure and then people can, access their stuff by popping on the Twitch interface or the whatever? Like, you can own your individual data and you can have all these different interfaces that they build their own network effects on top of it, charge you for services or whatever. Why does that require patents on that?
Well, Twitch is a good example. So take Twitch and now imagine Twitch 2. And Twitch 2 says, all right, we're Twitch, but we're a cent cheaper. Or like, let's say Twitch is getting on average, and obviously a lot lower than this, so maybe it's not the most practical example, but let's say Twitch is getting 1 cent every time you use the app. I know it's less than that. And then Twitch 2 says, all right, it's only going to cost a half cent because we can operate our backend more cheaply. All of a sudden, in the days of Twitter, like, it's not easy to port over that network. In the days of Twitch, potentially you can have the same exact experience where if you use Twitch 2, Twitch sees your Twitches. If you use Twitch, Twitch 2 sees your Twitches. Like, you can port over your network between the two apps, and you're just paying a slightly different price. In just that sort of idea in general of like, your audience is not, or your user base isn't unique to your platform. It's sort of shared across platforms.
That seems like a feature, not a bug.
It's a feature of BSV. It's a feature of BSV. It's a huge feature. It's the feature of BSV in a sense. But that it's almost like, why use BSV? It's because you can tap into the network of BSV. So if you have this huge network effect at the kind of protocol level, but at the application level, that's sort of what I'm talking about in terms of patenting, is like, right now at the application level, I think it's sort of, especially in like sort of IT sort of applications, or internet applications in general, I think there's a strategy of like, let's build fast and get users and establish a network that's our network. It's not going to be easy for them to just go somewhere else because the network's not going to follow them, or there's going to be some sort of high switching cost. And I think both of those things might be disappearing, where one, you take your network with you. It's the same network no matter where you go. And two, there's very low switching costs, because if you impose a high switching cost, it's a very counterproductive thing to do. So in that case, if you're a business, where are you going to get your margin? And potentially the way you do it is you can get some sort of patent or chain of patents where, by sort of innovating in some sort of technological feature or providing something unique, you can get a margin that way by being the only shop in town where you can do this thing. And I think in some ways, a lot of people would probably say that as sort of like an unethical approach. I think that's a reasonable case to make. But I also think from like a practical standpoint, it's something that businesses are going to have to take seriously. That's just my contention.
That's interesting. I would almost go the opposite and say that I think if you take that approach, you're most likely to get out competed by, alternative technology that doesn't. But Steve, did you have something to throw in? We got to wrap it up. My kids are starting to wander in behind my virtual background.
I was just going to say on that point, that sounds to me like trying to legally carve out a business where there might not be one. So like if the service that is being provided can actually be copied really easily and you save all the network effects, then shouldn't have a business there. That's not software that is valuable enough to generate a profit. That's just my intuition.
Well, it's just a matter of how much profit. And also it gets back to the sort of idea of IP, or sort of the defense of IP, which is that IP sort of generates an incentive to create new technologies. And what you're saying is that like these technologies are not valuable without IP, so therefore they should not be created. To me, that's like a very strong defense of the sort of concept of IP.
Well, IP does the opposite in practice. I mean, look at all the programming languages. Like those are all open source projects that are completely sustainable. They're highly competitive. I mean, what C++? Like, what if somebody came who said, I invented C++. Now Bitcoin, it's built on C++. You're not allowed to use it without my permission. You got to pay me. Like, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good for innovation. It's good for a few people, but it's unequivocally bad for innovation on a whole. IP is. There's no question in my mind empirically that is true.
The key, I think, is the innovation on a whole. So there's a way in which you could say it's still innovative, like to have a business model that restricts other people from coming in and copying you and competing with you is still, I guess, some sort of innovation. But I think on the whole, I definitely tend to have Isaac's position here that I don't think it's your kid just materialized, by the way, right next to that.
No, I hear you guys.
I got a question on Unbounded Capital. Because we're definitely not going to settle the IP.
Okay. This will be the last question. Then we'll bring it home. We'll leave people with a teaser. They'll want to know more about IP and they'll all go research it themselves. So go ahead, TK.
Suppose we wake up tomorrow morning and the world is on Bitcoin SV as you might imagine it to be, as you might wish it to be. What changes for Unbounded Capital in that world? What's different about your approach, your goals, your priorities, and so forth?
So a big part of our strategy right now is we have a decent position with BSV, the asset, and derivatives surrounding BSV. We picture ourselves pivoting to be a much more venture-focused fund in that world. So when we think there's going to be this big rebalance with people, currently underestimating BSV, once that happens, we don't picture, holding BSV forever. We want to invest in, currently it's mostly infrastructure companies. And then as those infrastructure companies succeed and they lower the barrier to entry for developers to make cool products, we want to invest in those. So the big difference for us will be less BSV, more venture. And also there's going to be a much bigger pool of companies to invest in.
I love it. Hey, gentlemen, this is a lot of fun. Thanks so much for coming on here. I think we're going to file a copyright or trademark for the numpties, and then we're gonna collect royalties on that. No, this is awesome. I think we've got ongoing conversations that are going to continue here. So excited to see everything you guys keep doing with Unbounded Capital.
You guys so much for having us. Yeah.
Thanks.
All right, later, boys.
Bye.